So we are now on session 4, right at the middle of our 6 weeks now, and we're going to be looking at the question of composition and AI, artificial intelligence. And prior to going into that question, I do want to start talking about this with respect to creativity. The reason why I want to start with the issue and the question of creativity is because not only am I biased to it, this is actually my area of research and my area in general with respect to artificial intelligence in industry, because I do a lot of work in industry. And I first want to step back and ask the question of what is creativity? Why do we even need to ask this particular question when we're addressing artificial intelligence? And it's going to become really important for our very super immediate future discussion on music and creativity and music and AI and robotics. So the big question of creativity, what is it? I'm not going to end up giving you a definite answer because there really isn't, but I thought that I would give you an idea of what it really refers to when we're talking about creativity. So creativity is ultimately about fundamentally characterizing human behavior and intelligence. And I put this little light bulb here and all the different parts and sort of concepts that we can think of when we study or we question this concept of creativity, which includes understanding how and why we set goals, how and why we reason through particular problems, how and why we transform and redefine information. What does it mean to make knowledge-based inferences? Also, part of this question of inferences, we can enter into what do we mean when we talk about the value of our actions. Also, part of this, perhaps now when you think of creativity, also think of imagination. So this is what I refer to when we start to ask then, what do we mean by imagining alternatives? And then another area within the study of creativity is this question of progressively building narratives. So this concept that we have an idea of something, we have a narrative of some sort, but we end up moving forward sort of in a hierarchical way to build a more complex or more transformative narrative. And that's going to become really interesting in the case of the arts and music. I'm not going to go into it, but I just wanted you to know that these are all the parts and pieces of what it means to be creative. Now, the study of creativity is actually pretty young, if we think about it in terms of the cognitive and brain sciences. And it's young because it really didn't come into fruition until the 1950s. In terms of really looking at it from an empirical standpoint. That's not to say that humans have not been questioning creativity. We most certainly have since the beginning of humankind, really, and really the ancient philosophers have been questioning what creativity is. However, looking at creativity from the cognitive brain perspective as an action, as a behavior that is perfectly observable, for which all of us human beings have the capacity for, that really did not start until the 1950s. Prior to that, it was pretty much, there were a lot of arguments and questions about whether it's something that came from divine intervention, if it was supernatural, or even that it was something that was only belonging to the elite groups of humanity. That actually comes from the Darwin concepts, and then really in the 1800s and the early parts of the 19th century. But that has been completely overridden with tons of amazing research since the 50s to today. So I do want to now enter this question in terms of human intelligence, because creativity is about asking this question of, well, are we humans the only ones who are creative? You know, is that what makes us human? And part of asking this question of does this make us human is the human intelligence question. And I do want to go through really quickly, just like a super summarized, brief summary of what is in human intelligence and where does our uniqueness lie. And I think sometimes people think, well, you know, because we have a big brain. Well, it turns out that bigger brains does not equate to greater intelligence. So it's not a matter of brain weight that makes us smarter. In this little graph here, hopefully you can see in this table, man is about, in weight, in grams, is only 1,250 to about 1,450 grams in comparison to whales. Whales are at 2,600 to 9,000. So this is just to give you some information here in terms of looking at the data of weight, that whales, the killer whale, the African elephant, have much heavier brains in comparison to ours, but we probably wouldn't say that they are more intelligent. When we compare to the gorilla and the chimpanzee, I highlight these in particular because they are our cousins, right? So in that respect, you can see that it's actually much smaller, but we would probably say that gorillas and chimps are much smarter, and I'm gonna put that in quotes, more intelligent than whales and the African elephant. So just keep that figure in mind. So here's the wonderful diagram that comes from this paper from Roth and Dike from 2005, in which they actually analyze all of this, and they look at brain size. And this is, again, just a comparative map to show that brain size, so not just weight, and brain size also does not mean greater intelligence. So look at our primate cousin here, the chimp. Here we are, the human, and then the toothed whale. The toothed whale has a much larger brain, and yet we probably would say that it's not as, again in quotes, as intelligent as us. Hopefully you're realizing as well that to start to begin to even define intelligence is already a problem, right? Where I haven't even defined it. We're now just talking here about neuroanatomy and structure. Perhaps it's an issue of encephalization. Encephalization is simply the fancy term for the evolutionary increase in complexity or relative size of the brain for greater mental demand. And so the idea is that, well, okay, through evolution, we have now this increased complexity because therefore it's going to allow for an increase in information processing capacity. And there's this other term called the quotient, the encephalization quotient, known as the EQ, which refers to the ratio of actual to predicted brain mass for a given species relative to its body mass. So all I want you to see from this image here, hopefully you're seeing that the different folds of the brain, see how it's becoming more and more folded. So you could basically say that there's much more in a compact space. So the issue with this is we can't really say much about it because it turns out that our quotient, we have actually quite a high quotient when it comes to EQ, encephalization quotient. However, there are other related cousins of ours who also have a pretty high EQ, and yet we would argue that they are not as quote unquote smart as us. Also, there's the question of what do we really mean by these parts of the brain that are folded and their mass or their size within the neocortex? So there's this question of what is the prefrontal cortex? So perhaps you're now saying, well, okay, our brain is much more folded, much more greater information processing capacity, and well, we have a bigger prefrontal cortex, which is this front part of the brain. And it turns out that this front part of the brain is really important for reasoning, attention, action planning, emotion regulation, executive function, higher order thinking. So you're saying, okay, well, that's what it means to be human. It turns out that this area, so literally, I put this circle here, it does not mean it refers, this is just a random, I just wanted to highlight that this particular area, it's really actually unclear the section that delineates the prefrontal cortex in comparison to different mammals. So when we look back to our primate cousins, that's an issue we need to take into consideration. Also, the human prefrontal cortex is not disproportionately larger than that of other primates. So by other primates, I'm really referring to our nearest cousins. So again, we're asking, okay, so if it's not about brain weight, brain size, this EQ quotient of relative size between brain and body, if it turns out the prefrontal cortex is not unique to us, well then what is it? What allows for our capacity of intelligence? Well, let's look at the neocortex. So the neocortex is, hopefully you can see in this image, it's all this part that's in yellow. This tends to be considered the newer part of the brain. Well, here's where perhaps the key to our intelligence lies. So the neocortex, it's probably due, so in this particular area, it turns out that the number of cortical neurons in millions, we have the highest. So in this graph here, remember where we saw that the whale, right, the whales, the elephant have a much bigger brain? Well, it turns out that the number of cortical neurons in millions here, 11,500 millions, is actually much higher than the other animals. And when we compare to our cousins, our primate cousins, the gorilla, the chimp, the rhesus monkey, we're at here 4,300, 6,200, 480. So it turns out that the human cortex has some, and I wrote it here so you can have the numbers, 29,800 synapses on average, resulting in a total of 3.6 times 10 to the 14th synapses. That's an enormous number. That's my point. So it is perhaps the argument now lies that it is that due to the number of cortical neurons in the neocortex, because we have the highest number, 11,500 million, greater than everyone else, all the other animals, that perhaps this is what then has led to our capacity of information processing. And it could be that this information processing capacity is therefore then what allows us for these higher order thinking capacities and therefore creativity. There are several arguments out there that it also has to do with the fact that we have a thumb. And so this becomes really interesting in terms of creating tools. And if you're a species that has to create tools, it means that you have to be able to do multiple types of actions and then think about the future, the past, and the present. Also another argument, and so tool making is related to higher cognitive activity and therefore the emergence of language. Another piece of evidence that is out there is that it has to do with our cooking capacity. So very way back at the beginning of humankind, our capacity to cook, to take meat, raw meat, and be able to cook it and change the molecular status of that meat, and to be able to ingest nutrients was very important for later developing this capacity of thinking and planning, because you have to think, you realize that, oh, if you change the molecular status of the meat that you're going to be eating or the plants or whatever you're eating, that is going to help for conserving energy and caloric intake and so forth and so on. So I'm just throwing that out these different theories, because we're coming more and more closer to a potential definition of what is human intelligence and how and why we need the capacity for creativity and how that has distinguished us from other species. And remember, I've mentioned this because and from day one, I really put this part of the argument with respect to music and the brain and language, simply because I want us to realize that perhaps then the reason why we have music is the result of this cognitive, neuroevolutionary, biological development in comparison to other species. All right, so let's now enter into the question of musical creativity. So what is it? I found this wonderful quote. I do apologize that it does come from the Western world, unfortunately, and it comes from Johannes Brahms, but I put it because I think it defines very nicely what the musical creative compositional experience is. I'll just read it very quickly. So in a semi-trance condition to get such results meaning a finished product revealed measure by measure, a condition when the conscious mind is in temporary abeyance and the subconscious is in control, for it is through the subconscious mind comes. A composer must have mastered the technique of composition, form, theory, harmony, counterpoint instrumentation. My compositions are not the fruits of inspiration alone, but of severe, laborious, and painstaking toil. So Johannes Brahms said this when talking about when he was interviewed and asked about how he creates his compositions and why he does it. And the reason why I put it is because it actually summarizes a lot of really interesting things about what creativity is and what the compositional nature of musical creativity is. And it refers to several things. So one is he's talking about the separation of the conscious mind versus the unconscious. Another issue he mentions is having a mastery of the core knowledge of what music is, so the theoretical knowledge and how important that is and it's necessary. And then the next thing he mentions is this sort of contrasting situation of it's about inspiration, it's about ideation and expression, but it's also about a lot of hard work. So the reason why I bring this up is because precisely before the 1950s, this idea of creativity being something that comes out of divine intervention really is, and so not just coming from divine intervention, but also is the result of just an elite group of individuals, really goes to show that it's much more than that. And that's not enough of an explanation. And many times when you talk to highly creative individuals, and by highly creative individuals, I mean individuals that have been named as such by society under societal standards, is that it's not just about learning big amounts of pieces of information and knowledge about a particular domain, but it's about a lot of practice. It's a lot about hard work. And really there's a question of perhaps you need to have those 10,000 hours, right, in order to master that particular activity. And once you've mastered it, are you then able to enter into ideation, imagination, problem solving, decision making, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the really interesting concepts that comes about is this question of flow. And that's what Brahms is talking about in terms of this disambiguation of the subconscious and the conscious. And flow is basically a mental state of being completely present and fully immersed in a particular task. This concept of flow, and the idea is that it's a very strong contributor to creativity. And this particular concept does not just refer to musical creativity, it actually refers to any domain. It has been applied to sports, to business, to the medical field, really all fields. But the idea is that when in a flow state, so this is a concept that was created by the Hungarian-American psychologist in 1975 by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I'm probably butchering his last name, but I mention him simply as someone who was profoundly influential in coming up with this theory and being extremely relevant to the field of positive psychology, if you are familiar with that particular mindset in the psychological world. But the reason why it's important is that this issue of flow really refers to the fact that the creator and the environment around the creator becomes a single state. And it's when outside distractions basically recede from consciousness and one's mind is fully open and attuned to the act of creating. And I'm sure this is a state in which many of you, probably all of you, have experienced, you know, when you're doing something and you don't even realize the fan is, you know, moving, you don't realize that somebody's out there screaming, and you don't realize anything. You're completely 100% in that flow state, in the zone, in that particular situation. And I mention this because one of the big questions and the way in which we create experiments to address this question of creativity is to get at this particular mental state. And so let's bridge this now to music. So one of the ways in which we can test this is, especially if we want to do brain imaging, and by brain imaging, I mean fMRI, so that means functional magnetic resonance imaging, or EEG, or MEG. We need to look at the act of improvisation. So I do want to now start, so hopefully you're noticing I'm starting to give you parts of the definition of creativity, in which now I'm talking about a very in-the-moment, spontaneous situation of flow, of creative output. This does not mean that creativity cannot be long-term endurance. It most certainly can, and there are, when we think of big historical examples of highly creative individuals, let's take someone like Leonardo da Vinci, for example. I mean, this is an individual like other individuals in which it's years and years of study and literally entry into these flow states, probably, if not every day, but across many, many years of their lifetime. However, for the brain studies, you cannot have somebody sitting in a scanner 24/7 for a week, right? So you have to come up with a model to test this immediate spontaneous flow state, and that's what we mean by improvisation. And as I've written here, you know, as with language, expert musicians can actually generate a potentially infinite number of novel, contextually useful, so meaningful musical phrases by combining a finite set of notes and rhythms, and we can test those mini creations in real time. So that would be what I mean by improvisation. And so when we think of improvisation, for those of you who are musicians, this is where now we start to then create categories within the musical world, and we can think of the classically trained musicians versus, let's say, for example, individuals that are from day one taught to improvise. So that tends to be jazz musicians. So jazz musicians therefore become really interesting individuals to study precisely because they have that training and they can create and they can generate really an infinite number of new musical phrases that the classical musician is not capable of, at least in the immediate moments. But I'm not saying here that they're not expert. Both of those groups of individuals are experts in music. It just means that we're probably talking about a different mindset and use of brain areas that has become, that these individuals have been habituated to due to learning strategies and styles. And so with respect to the types of studies that are done in looking at musical improvisation, and again, in particular, looking at jazz musicians as the test subjects, we can look at 3 different types of studies. So there's the creation of new material. So this is the question of, okay, let's put one of these individuals in the brain scanner and let's have them improvising a simple melody. And so what that means, as in this picture, they are lying down in this machine. If you've ever been in this machine, you can imagine what this is like. It's extremely uncomfortable and it's very loud. So they have noise canceling headphones and they have a keyboard, and unfortunately it's not the full 88 keys. It's just 3 octaves. So it's a highly reduced environment of what would be the typical situation. So yes, it's true that it's not ecologically valid. However, it is it's a highly controlled environment. So creation of new material is looking at what happens in the brain when an improvisational musician creates new material in comparison to rehearsed material. By rehearsed material, we mean basically, for example, just playing like a C major scale or any scale in a repetitive loop fashion. Another question we can ask is the perception of new material. So one thing is what the individual is creating, but what about the person who's watching the creation of that material? Perhaps you've been in that situation where you go to a jazz concert, right? And because of societal expectations, you say, oh, well, they're jazz musicians. They're most obviously creating new material. Now, whether you're a musician or not, this is going to be obvious or not. And being a musician, I'm sure you can identify those musical differences and new material, but there's the question of, what about the non-musician? Does the non-musician realize or understand that the material being performed, outputted by these jazz musicians, is actually new or not? I will give you some interesting evidence that has come from those studies. I will mention the first one in a bit, but for this particular one of perception of new material, it has been shown that even non-musicians are capable of identifying whether the material jazz musicians are creating is new or not in a pretty accurate way. And you know what they do? They actually do not use the musical cues as a way to determine it. They're using the body cues, which is fascinating because it also goes to show that the creative musical improvisational process situation is not just about the output, literally the auditory musical output you create, but it's also the body language in which you as a soloist, or most likely in a jazz situation with your colleagues on stage, the back and forth communication that's happening, you are expressing it also through a lot of body cues and even also talking to each other. Sometimes it does happen in live performances. So there's a lot of stuff happening, is my point. With respect to the third question, so there is, you can ask the question of, well, okay, so new materials being made between these musicians. It sounds like they're having a conversation. And musicians, when you talk to them about this, when you ask them, they're like, oh yeah, I was totally jamming with my friend there, right? I was totally having a conversation. And we're like, okay, well, but from the empirical standpoint, are they really having a conversation in the linguistic sense? And it turns out that they are. So this was actually a study that I myself did when I was a postdoc at Hopkins in the School of Medicine, in which we looked at a musician who was in the fMRI scanner, And then there was a musician outside of the scanner who was what we call trading fours, so trading back and forth with the musician in the scanner. And it turned out that linguistic parts of the brain, remember Broca's and Wernicke's areas where we talked about with language, about semantic and production, capacity and comprehension of language, those areas were activated during that. So it really goes to show that yes, the parts of the brain, the linguistic parts of the brain that are activated during language communication are also activated during this trading force within musicians. So it truly is a dialogue, in other words. Now, with respect to the creation of new material, I didn't really mention what the data is, but I just want to show you this diagram here that comes from Jung et al. Paper from 2013. And I literally took a screenshot from this particular paper because it is nice in that it summarizes a whole bunch of research that has been done with respect to this question of the creation of new material. And it goes to show that multiple parts of the brain are activated, but very specific parts. So I just want to point to the ones relevant to our conversation here. So here is where I'm kind of putting the cursor, is the Wernicke's area. So here's the temporal lobe, remember, auditory processing, language processing. Also this part here of the temporal lobes, right, because all this temporal lobe, auditory. We have here prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex is activated. We also see it here being activated. And then more internally in the brain, we're now seeing emotion areas being activated. This becomes emotion regulation part of the brain. This also becomes part of the emotion parts of the brain. This is on the other looking at the brain on the other side, and the temporal lobe. Also Wernicke's areas, association cortices, and then also part of somatosensory parts of the brain. So and motor cortices makes sense, right? You're in this heightened level of activity. So what this means, summary here, is that we do see what we call, fancy term here, parasylvian language regions of the brain. So that's the whole Broca's and Wernicke's areas, motor areas being activated. So just really quick. So that's this part of the premotor cortex, motor cortex, somatosensory cortex. And then we have the prefrontal cortex being activated. And so what this means is that, okay, it makes sense. You're in this heightened performance state of creating new material. And with respect to the prefrontal cortex, we see two really interesting things. We see decreased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And I'm going to show you a part where that is exactly in the prefrontal cortex. But by decreased activity in this area, it's been concluded that it's because of this attenuation of awareness. So remember I mentioned this flow state. I showed you this diagram, and I was mentioning that it's entering into this completely immersed moment of the task where you've completely forgotten about the lights on, the fan, the noise, and everything. And you're just focused on that task. Well, it turns out that this issue that was brought up in the 70s, perhaps from the neurological perspective, when we see deactivation in the dorsal would be here. So the dorsolateral, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Well, it's more about this part. This particular part of the brain. So because we see decreased activity, perhaps this means that we are no longer focusing on all of this other extra junk that's not relevant for the particular task. So I also want to mention why this is really significant from the brain perspective in comparison to historical issues is because when, I don't know if you guys are aware that in 1924 we have the Surrealist movement, which was an artistic movement that came forth, and it really was about, they talked about how entering into creative space was when you completely let go of political issues, aesthetic issues, everything, you just let go. And this flow state that they were literally talking about in 1924, we have it more formally developed in psychology in 1975, and then more recently from the brain imaging work that we've seen in the 2000s, we have now this neurological evidence that we compare with these historical concepts and theories that have been proposed. And so now we can bring together psychological theory with neurological evidence. And then we see increased activity in the medial prefrontal cortex. So let me explain this a little more. So here in the prefrontal cortex, that's all this area I'm circling with my cursor. So just another 2 areas I want you to keep in mind here. So the ventral, so VMPFC, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, is connected to the amygdala and the cingulate cortex in the limbic system. And so that's going back to our image here. That would be these internal parts. And it's implicated in emotional logical evaluation of behavior. So if this part of the brain is activated during this improvisational state, it makes sense, right? So because you are in this flow state as much as you are in this emotional expressive state. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so that you understand what's happening here, how it's related to attenuation of awareness, is that this part of the brain, which is about here located, it receives input from the sensory cortices, so that's the parietal, occipital, and temporal. And it sends direct input to the to the motor cortices. So going back here, this dorsolateral part of the brain is going to send information to the motor cortices, which are about here, and where we see activation specifically in the study here. So that's really important, because then when we talk about being in this heightened state of motoric activity / expression / flow, we see that we can come to this theory with understanding these different brain areas being activated. And we can see this because of neuroimaging technology, which became prominent in the 1990s and more significantly now in the 2000s. Okay, so now let's bridge this with artificial intelligence and what this means, because the field of music composition is radically changing, and I have some wonderful clips I want to show you. So I just love this diagram because it's this big question of what is the relationship we want to have with computers and machines in general. And that's a whole nother, that could be an entire lesson in itself in terms of the different domains. But with respect to music, we can ask the question of what does it mean to create algorithms that will either enhance or augment human creativity. And there are 3 areas in which this is being debated, questioned, experimented on. And one of them is to literally, let's create new music. So let's create algorithms that can help us create new music. So that means that if we're creating new music, we're merging together human music with machine music. A second question that comes up, and another empirical domain, is what does it mean to facilitate meaningful musical interactions between humans and machines? So what if we were to create robotic machines, so another robotic musician, and if we were to pair that robotic musician with the human? So how does that create a new concept of what the musical experience is? And then finally, well, what about, so this is really what we mean by augmentation of human creativity and human capacity, is, well, let's combine what is unique to us humans, which is our capacity for expression, understanding, and emotions, with what robots are really good at, or machines are really good at, which means they have amazing, powerful processing capacity and memory capacity. I mean, you know this from your computers, right? When you want to take, let's say, just do a mathematical equation, I mean, you literally push the numbers in your computer and it immediately calculates it. We take more time. So just that's what I mean by powerful processing capacity. Sophisticated mathematical transformations, where algorithms have this capacity to just do an enormous amount in immediate, speedy, and quick time. Robust long-term memory, we know, certainly also with the degeneration of our brain, whether due to age or whether due to other problems, our memories, they decline. In computers, it doesn't. So that's what I mean by robust long-term memory. And then accuracy without practice. We humans need those 10,000 hours, right, or more to become what we call, and I put it in quotes, experts. Reason why I put expert in quote is simply because that is a cultural concept, and again, that's a whole nother issue to walk down, path to discuss, but this concept of, well, okay, well, we need practice. We really need to be repeating and going over this new material multiple times so that we can become somebody who is highly expert at something. Robots don't need this. Literally, you can create the machine and put in the algorithms, and literally the next day can be called an expert musician. And so maybe we can merge that amazing capacity of robots with our amazing capacity of emotions and expression. So what happens? So I want to give you some examples. One of them comes from the Wolfram Automata. So this is an individual who created what he called a computational universe. And so the premise was that he would use very simple rules or programs to give rise to an amazing array of behavioral complexity. And so he created experiments in the 1980s, and they were known as the Wolfram Automata. And the idea is that you could take rows of cells, and in this case, so a little diagram here, rows of cells, black and white, and then you would use particular rules to determine where they're placed in this map of black and white cells. And it turns out that you could come up, so using this very simple example here, that you could come up with about 256 elementary rules. And so the particular example is looking at what rule 30 would be. So then you convert that. So this is where you're identifying the different rules. And then rule 30 is you can create this highly complex image. Okay, so what does this have to do with music? Well, it turns out that you can use this image to then create music. And so this is an example in which, so taking this diagram that's created, you zoom in to a part of the diagram, and in particular, this part of the peak of this sort of hill. You turn it over, and then you say, well, the height of a black square, so starting from the bottom and going upward, you can match that height to a particular pitch. So that's what this researcher did. So he basically then picked a scale, and then based on the different heights, he gave them particular pitches. And so this particular one, turns out that they picked, you just pick a scale, and then you determine a pitch, and then you get different aspects of these patterns can then be transformed to relate to a melodic line, a bass track, and so forth. And this is the specific, hopefully everyone can see it. I'm at the Wolfram Tones, and I totally suggest that you write it down, tones.wolfram.com, so you can play with it. And the idea is that you can literally pick a musical style. I don't know, let's pick hip hop. Then you can pick the type of rule you want. Just to take some 167. And then you can vary the type of patterns within that rule. Then you can basically select different heights here and so forth, etc. You can actually choose the type of musical scale you want. Do you want a blues? I don't know. Let's go for a blues octatonic. And then what you do is then you can play. So what it's doing, hopefully you guys can hear that. Or nodding your heads to it. So you can have fun with it. You can really see how taking back that concept I was mentioning, which I literally took it from here. So I did screenshots, you can go back to it. So taking this concept of these very basic rules, you can come up with highly complex music. So this really was part of the beginning of really merging a lot of this, along with other research that was done by David Cope, also in the 80s and 90s, in which he took all the music of Bach, put it in an algorithm, and then the output was a completely new piece of Bach that Bach had never created, but would be in the style of Bach. So that's, again, extracting all the rules that make up Bach, much in a similar way here, where you're extracting all these rules from a basic image diagram to then put them together in an algorithm to have an output and therefore new music. Now, what about in other domains of music? So actually not too long ago, we had one of the first uses of artificial intelligence in the pop world. And this particular artist decided to use an algorithm created by a private sector company. So here, this was the case in which the instrumentation was composed by artificial intelligence, and Taryn Southern, she actually created the lyrics, and she decided the types of vocal melodies she wanted, and she used this algorithm, this particular software, to give her ideas, and then she put everything together. So just really quick, we'll hear just a few seconds, in which this is a really nice example from the pop world, in which
what I can see, I wish I could touch beyond what I can touch. I wish I could.
So it's a very pop song, right? The idea here is that this is now a merging of software, taking the rules, the basic concept of what pop music is about, so the types of rhythms that are used, the type of instrumentation is used, giving options to a musician who says, oh, you know, I have a set of lyrics I want, that I'm working on, that I'm inspired by, and I kind of can't really, I don't know where I want to go with it, but I know that I want it in D minor, and I want it to be like a Largo type of song, and then you can give, you know, I want a certain type of rhythmic pattern, and so you can actually pick and choose in the software to then create new music. So there's some fascinating research coming from Georgia Tech in which they've actually created a third arm, robotic arm. I believe they initially created the arm for prosthetic purposes, so individuals, right, who due to an accident or congenital situation in which they wanted to be a musician and they needed an arm, and so it was created so that they could have full arm movement capacity, and then they've now used it for now more for a fun sort of augmentation purpose of, well, let's add, you know, if I'm a drummer, can I add a third arm? This group has also created a robotic marimbaist. So hopefully you can see here, this is also jot this down this website because you can totally play around with all the different videos they have. So this is their Center for Music Technology, and they have multiple projects, as I mentioned. So let me go to Shimon here. And what's great about Shimon is that it is a robotic marimbaist. And has actually using multiple types of technology of vision, perception, music, perception, cognition. So all these issues we've been talking about, breaking the different building blocks of music, as well as the visual cues from the humans around, and somatostatic perception, has been able to perform live with actual human expert musicians. And I'm going to show you. There's just a great, they're great clips. Again, do write this website down. So it's bobbing its head. Everybody see that? So you could say, is this robot a musician? Have we succeeded in creating robotic musicians? So this is now an open question I'm going to ask you. What is music? What is creativity? What does it mean to be human? If we can create this. There's the drummer with his arm and the bobbing of the... So now I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm making sure now each time we have more and more time for that. Again, the reason why I give you these examples is because, and the reason why I started with the question of what is creativity, can we really define it? I kind of gave you bits and pieces in terms of problem solving, adapting to an environment, creating something new, transforming information, requiring lots of study to do it, entering into a flow state. And then ask the artificial intelligence question because now that we have the capacity with computer processing as well as with highly sophisticated algorithms, our next question becomes, is it possible that our human capacity for music, can we translate that? Is it possible to translate it to the machine? And if we do that, does that now change what creativity means? Does that now change what the musical experience is? Does that now change how we think about robots? So I'm gonna open to the questions. Okay, so one, yes, is the robot just an output mechanism? Certainly. You could say that we humans are just an output mechanism. At the end of the day, cognitive science, when it was born in 1956, took as a hypothesis, as a premise that basically equated and said, we human beings are organic machines. And we took principles and concepts and ideas and theories from computer science to understand human cognition perception. So maybe we are machines ourselves. We just happen to be organic. And just finally, because now class time is over. How does that relate to universal emotions? Well, it's a big question mark. It just goes to show that we can program what we mean by happy emotions versus sad emotions versus angry emotions, disgust type emotions. Yeah, sure, we can do that. We can come up with algorithms for that. But is the robot actually feeling it the way you and I will feel it? The answer is no. But then, of course, you could say, but if we can't even answer our own concept of consciousness, how can I dare to question the consciousness of the robot? I don't know. Is the robot feeling it or not? Let's ask it. So class is over, and we'll take for here in terms of time constraints and so forth. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend and then rest of the week.